June 22nd, 1944, 4 a.m. The dense forests and marshes of Belarusia lay shrouded in pre-dawn mist. You could almost feel the heavy summer air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, as tens of thousands of Soviet guns suddenly roar to life. The horizon erupts in a blinding flash. 36,000 artillery pieces and Katyusha rocket launchers unleash a hurricane of steel across a 450-kilometer front. The ground trembles violently. Trees splinter like matchsticks. Entire German trenches collapsing on themselves, burying men alive. Communications wires snap. Bunkers 30 meters underground shake, as if the earth itself is screaming. For the soldiers of German Army Group Center, veterans who had once driven deep into the Soviet heartland during Barbarossa, this was no ordinary barrage. It was apocalyptic. Lieutenant Neuber, commanding a battery of howitzers south of Mogilev, watched in horror as 2 of his guns vanished in the first minutes. Crewmen died instantly, the sky filled with a howl of incoming shells. When the Soviet infantry finally surged forward at dawn, they came in endless human waves, supported by T-34 tanks fitted with mine plows cutting through the minefields. German machine guns chattered desperately, cutting down hundreds, but more kept coming. By mid-morning, forward positions began crumbling. Partisans had already severed rail lines and bridges behind the lines for days, leaving German reinforcements stranded. The Wehrmacht had expected an attack. But not here, not with this overwhelming fury. Hitler and his generals had been deceived by masterful Soviet Maskirovka, convinced the main blow would fall further south in Ukraine. Their mobile reserve sat idle hundreds of kilometers away. Soviet troops, hardened by years of brutal fighting, pushed forward with grim determination. For many Red Army soldiers, this was more than liberation. It was long overdue revenge for burned villages, mass graves, and the unimaginable suffering under Nazi occupation. Yet even they were stunned by how quickly the German lines, once feared as unbreakable, started to fracture. The collapse had begun, but no one yet realized just how fast and how total it would become. The thunder of artillery still echoed across the marshes as Soviet spearheads from the First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration and the Third Belarusian Front under Colonel General Ivan Chernikovsky slammed into northern and central sectors. Vitebsk, a key German strongpoint, found itself under ferocious assault. Soviet infantry, supported by relentless close-air support from IL-2 Sturmovix, tore gaps in the German defenses. The 39th and 43rd Armies enveloped the city. Inside the pocket, German troops of the 3rd Panzer Army fought desperately, but their fuel and ammunition were already running low. Hitler's infamous no-retreat orders, stand fast and hold every position, turned potential fighting withdrawals into death traps. Further south, General Konstantin Rokossovsky's powerful First Belarusian Front unleashed a double-pronged attack toward Bobruisk. Rokossovsky, a brilliant commander who had survived Stalin's purges, had convinced Stavka to strike with overwhelming force on both flanks of the German Ninth Army. The result was devastating. By June 27th, the Ninth Army under General Hans Jordan was being sliced apart. Soviet tanks raced through breaches, bypassing strongpoints and encircling entire divisions. German soldiers who had once advanced with arrogant confidence now stared in disbelief as their carefully prepared defensive lines dissolved. Reports flooded back to Field Marshal Ernst Busch's headquarters. Entire regiments vanishing, communications breaking down, panzers immobilized for lack of fuel. Soviet troops advancing to the liberated villages saw the horrors left behind. Mass graves of civilians, destroyed homes, evidence of atrocities that fueled their fury and resolve. For the Red Army soldiers, the speed was exhilarating yet surreal. They had expected a grinding battle against a still formidable foe. Instead, German resistance, though fierce in places, was fragmenting faster than anyone anticipated. Pockets of desperate Germans fought on, but the momentum was shifting violently. The flanks were not just bending, they were shattering. And in the center, the trap was about to close. By late June, the Soviet juggernaut had created massive gaps in the German front. The Fourth Army, holding the center under General Kurt von Tippelskirch, found itself in mortal danger as Soviet forces from multiple fronts converged. T-34s and heavy IS-2 tanks roared through the forests and swamps, their crews pushing hard despite exhaustion and muddy terrain. Behind them came waves of infantry and artillery. The Germans, stripped of mobile reserves thanks to the successful deception, could only react in panic. Hitler sacked Bush on June 28th and replaced it with a defensive Master Walter model. But even model arrived to a collapsing situation. The Soviet plan, deep battle in its purest form, was working with terrifying efficiency. Spearheads bypassed strong points, severed supply lines, and linked up far behind German lines. By the end of June, the German Fourth Army was being enveloped near Minsk, while remnants of the Ninth Army were trapped around Bobruisk. Soviet troops couldn't believe their eyes. Villages that had flown the swastika for 3 years were liberated in hours. Abandoned German equipment littered the roads, trucks, guns, even panzers with engines still running. One Red Army soldier later recalled the strange silence after the initial breakthroughs. The enemy that seemed so invincible was suddenly running, scattering, surrendering in droves. Yet the fighting remained brutal. In the pockets, cornered German units fought with the desperation of trapped animals. But the numbers were overwhelming. Nearly 2.5 million Soviet troops, backed by thousands of tanks and guns, against a German force already hollowed out and caught off balance. Minsk itself, the capital of Belarusia, lay just days away. The road to the west was opening, and with it, the realization that Army Group Center was facing annihilation on a scale never before seen. July 3, 1944, Soviet forces stormed into the smoking ruins of Minsk. The city that had endured 3 years of brutal German occupation was finally free. But liberation came at a terrible price. Both sides had bled heavily. Still, for the advancing Red Army columns, the sight was unforgettable. German prisoners marching in long, broken columns, their once proud uniforms torn and filthy. The speed of the collapse left even seasoned Soviet commanders stunned. In just over 10 days, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers. Entire German armies, the 3rd Panzer, 4th, and 9th, had been effectively destroyed. Of the 34 divisions in Army Group Center at the start, 28 were wiped out or shattered. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Soviet troops moving to the liberated territories saw the full horror of Nazi rule. Mass graves, razed towns, evidence of genocide that hardened their hearts. Yet amid the vengeance, there was also awe at their own success. They had expected a tough summer campaign. Instead, they witnessed the once mighty Wehrmacht unraveling before their eyes. German officers who had laughed at Soviet capabilities in 1941 now stared at the ground in disbelief as they were herded into captivity. Stalin celebrated the victory dramatically. On July 17th, over 57,000 German prisoners, including captured generals, were paraded to the streets of Moscow in a humiliating spectacle. The message to the world and to the crumbling German high command was unmistakable. The Eastern Front had broken wide open. The Soviets had not just won a battle. They had obliterated an entire army group in weeks. The road to Poland, the Baltic states, and eventually East Prussia now lay dangerously exposed. But the advance was far from over, and the human costs on both sides continued to mount. As July turned to August, the Soviet steamroller kept rolling westward. Red Army units advanced up to 15 miles a day in places, outpacing their own supply lines at times. The remnants of Army Group Center, what little was left, retreated in chaos toward the Vistula River and the pre-war Polish border. Field Marshal Model did everything possible to stabilize the line, but the damage was catastrophic. Nearly 500,000 German casualties, thousands of vehicles and guns lost. The Eastern Front, which had once threatened to swallow the Soviet Union, was now pushing relentlessly toward the heart of the Reich. For the Soviet troops, the disbelief had turned to fierce pride mixed with exhaustion. They had achieved what seemed impossible after years of horrific losses. The speed of the German collapse, from seemingly solid defensive lines to total disintegration, left many whispering in wonder around their campfires. How could the fascists break so fast? Yet the fighting was never easy. Rear guard actions were savage. German units fought to the death in isolated pockets. The Red Army paid a heavy price too. Over 750,000 casualties in the operation, with nearly 180,000 dead or missing. But the momentum was unstoppable. By mid-August, the operation officially wound down, but the Red Army stood on the threshold of Poland and the Baltic states, threatening East Prussia itself. Operation Bagration had delivered the greatest single defeat in German military history. It fulfilled Stalin's promise to support the Allies in the West after D-Day, and it signaled to every German soldier, from the lowliest private to the high command, that the war in the East was lost. The path to Berlin had been opened. The Soviet troops who had stared in amazement as the German lines collapsed now marched forward with grim certainty. The nightmare that began in 1941 was finally turning toward its end.